July 1987. A blistering Japanese summer is in full swing, its effects still felt even beneath a fading sun. As with many Japanese homes, yours was designed for maximum airflow, which helps most days, but not so much this one. You once again kick yourself for stubbornly refusing to buy that AC unit. To try to escape the heat, you retreat to the darkest corner you can find that just so happens to be where your little MSX2 has been stashed away. To a chorus of cicadas, you angle a small personal fan directly at your face and settle down in front of the computer. Maybe some games can distract you from your sweat-soaked clothes or that rent payment due in 2 weeks. Something new had just come out, a game called Metal Gear. On the lark, you nabbed a copy on your way home, so you boot up the MSX2, cycle through the start screen, and, unbeknownst to you, take your first steps into a franchise that, over the next 40 years, would routinely disrupt the gaming landscape and launch the career of one Hideo Kojima into the stratosphere. Forgive the dramatic setup, Metal Gear as a series has come to mean so much to gaming culturally and to myself personally that when speaking on the subject, I can't help but let a bit of purple color my prose. And while this often overlooked first title in the series is a rather poor representation of that legacy, it is still a fascinating little piece of software in its own right. Konami at the time was looking to make an action game and tasked Hideo Kojima, whose previous experience begins and ends with the game Penguin Adventure, with spearheading the project. Thing is, the MSX2 wasn't really conducive to high-octane action. It was underpowered compared to its contemporaries, lacking screen scrolling and unable to render all that many sprites and bullets at one time. Kojima, as would become a hallmark of his, turned to pop culture and movies in order to resolve these issues. Taking inspiration from the film The Great Escape, he settled on a stealth and infiltration-focused experience rather than going guns blazing. This approach proved to be a hit, with the MSX2 version selling well in Japan, while the NES port sold over 1 million units in the US alone, and thus the modern blueprint for the stealth action genre was born. When it comes to my history with this specific title, honestly there's not much to tell. I didn't get around to playing the original Metal Gear until I want to say the summer before Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain came out. There were a couple mainline entries I hadn't gotten to previously, specifically Metal Gear 1 and 2 and Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, so I did a full series playthrough to prep for the Phantom Pain. I remember enjoying Metal Gear at the time, though admittedly it didn't super stand out to me. It didn't help that narratively this first game is pretty bare bones, especially if you're familiar with the rest of the series. Seeing as the goal with my playthrough was to get up to date on the story, I mostly just bolted through this first game to get to what I thought of was the good stuff. As for my history with the series as a whole, oh boy, where do I start? It's not an overstatement to say that I would not be who I am or where I am today without Metal Gear Solid. I still remember the day my brain chemistry was irrevocably altered because of MGS. It began with the June 2008 issue of Game Informer magazine. The cover was Guitar Hero 4, which would later be renamed to Guitar Hero World Tour. Back then, the second and third to the last pages in each issue would have a short 2-page article that typically didn't fit in elsewhere in the magazine. One example I remember fondly was a short retrospective on Panzer Dragoon Saga and the mess that was that game's development. The following month would see the release of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, and to mark the occasion, this section was dedicated to a very abridged summary of the story and lore of the series thus far. I'd seen articles on MGS4 in previous issues, but always sort of skimmed past them. Between the title, the gray and brown color palette, and the soldiers and guns dominating screenshots, I quickly wrote it off as just another military shooter in the vein of Call of Duty or Battlefield, a genre I have zero affinity for or interest in. Which is why, upon seeing this particular article, my curiosity was piqued. Why bother going over the story of a military shooter? The pages were also littered with absolutely gorgeous Yoji Shinkawa art, and between these two things, I figured I'd give the article a once-over, if just to see what the hubbub was all about. So I read, and reread, and made my friends read, because within these pages I found tales of clones and ninja and vampires and mechs and conspiracies and betrayal. It was quite literally everything a 14-year-old me could have possibly wanted in a game series. Starting that day, every time my dad and I would go to the local Walmart, I would ogle the special edition MGS4 PS3 locked up tight in the game display case. Several weeks later, I was able to convince him to pick me up the last copy of the Metal Gear Solid Essential Collection sitting on a random Best Buy shelf. This collection contained the first 3 games, each with some killer Yoji Shinkawa cover art. And then finally, in August 2009, my dad caved and got me a PS3, and you just know MGS4 was one of the first games I got for it. And the rest, as they say, is history, though don't worry, I have many more tales to tell as I cover the rest of the series. But jumping ahead for now, as of writing, I am almost exactly 16 years removed from the day I was properly introduced to Metal Gear. Kojima has long since moved on from the series, though it appears a spiritual successor is in the works. Konami, after sitting idle for some time, is returning to the well with a full remake of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. And here I sit, amidst a balmy Pacific Northwest summer. These months have long belonged to two things in my mind, RPGs and Metal Gear. For the moment, I've had my fill of the former, and so, if you would grant me this indulgence, I would like to dive into the latter and begin a journey that will take some time, but will hopefully be worth following in each and every step as I attempt to put into words the highs and the lows that embody my love for and occasional frustration with both Metal Gear and the works of Hideo Kojima as a whole. As mentioned in the intro, the story of Metal Gear is light, relying primarily on its setup to carry the experience until things take a turn near the end. As such, I will be spoiling the game in its entirety, but I want to stress that, unlike later entries, the story is not what I would come to this game for. That honor goes to the gameplay, so even knowing what occurs doesn't really hinder the experience in my opinion. That said, feel free to skip ahead to the presentation section if you'd rather remain unspoiled. The year is 1995. An unknown legendary mercenary has established a base going by the name Outer Heaven in a remote part of South Africa. Rumors arise suggesting that within the walls of Outer Heaven, this mercenary is busily developing a weapon of mass destruction. Special military unit Foxhound, led by a man going by the name Big Boss, sends in one of their top operatives, codenamed Grey Fox, to infiltrate Outer Heaven and learn the secrets of this weapon. However, several days later, contact is lost and all that's left to go on is Grey Fox's final transmission, just 2 words, Metal Gear. Big Boss turns to a new recruit, codenamed Solid Snake, tasking him with infiltrating Outer Heaven, locating Grey Fox, learning the specifics of Metal Gear, and eliminating it. That's both the setup and around 90% of the game's story. You sneak around Outer Heaven, rescue hostages, gather intel, find and free Grey Fox, learn that the engineer leading the Metal Gear project, Dr. Madnar, is only doing so because his daughter is being held captive, and gradually close in on your target, Metal Gear, which turns out to be a nuclear-armed bipedal tank. However, as you enter the endgame, your commander, Big Boss, begins to act strangely. Up to this point, he's been helpful, providing minor direction and guidance, but as Snake draws closer to Metal Gear, he becomes erratic, making suggestions that place Snake directly in the line of enemy fire before outright attempting to abort the mission. Snake persists and discovers that the legendary mercenary behind Outer Heaven was Big Boss all along. Snake was set up to fail from the beginning. He's green, lacking experience, and Big Boss hoped to exploit that in order to give them time to finish Metal Gear and enter the world stage as a nuclear-equipped superpower. But Snake was more capable than Big Boss could have ever imagined, besting both Metal Gear and Big Boss himself. Seeing no other options, Big Boss sets the entire base to self-destruct. Snake manages to make it out in time, leaving both Outer Heaven and his former mentor lying in ash. Or so he would believe, but one last transmission after the credits reveals that Big Boss is alive and planning his revenge. Like I said, it's simple, straightforward, but with a last-minute twist to add a wrinkle to the proceedings. Complex motivations are non-existent, and the same goes for in-depth characterization. This Solid Snake doesn't even speak, contrary to the constantly questioning and gravelly-toned David Hayter portrayal fans may be used to. It's a gameplay-first endeavor, but even then, there is a reason why this series later became a narrative juggernaut. Even at its most barren, Kojima's interest in the geopolitical landscape of the time, as well as his love of winding, twist-heavy plots and his desire to marry gameplay and narrative elements are all on display, albeit in a much more limited capacity. This could be me reading a bit too much into things or using hindsight to describe meaning and intent where there wasn't any at the time, but I can't help but see the nascent Kojima-isms that would come to dominate his later works, indicating to me at least that the direction the series would go in following this title is not completely out of left field. Being a late 80s release on a low-spec machine, you shouldn't go in expecting too much from Metal Gear on the graphics front. That said, the presentation here oddly sits better with me than a lot of games from the time, especially those on the NES. For example, the NES port of this title, despite technically being on superior hardware, isn't as appealing to me. I think what it comes down to is the colors. I couldn't tell you why this is the case, but a lot of color choices on something like the NES tend to feel garish. Castlevania 1 through 3 come to mind in this regard, with the most artistically successful NES titles in my opinion going more simplistic in both detail and color choices, something like Mega Man or Earthbound Beginnings. Metal Gear on the MSX2, however, doesn't have that issue. The color palette is still limited, but wide enough to nail the dark browns, greens, and grays necessary to make this environment readable as a military base, while also keeping characters and important environmental details distinct. On the sound front, your trek through Outer Heaven will be defined by the persistent droning of Theme of Tara, a 2-minute track that plays on loop in most of the game's areas. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know how well I can really appraise the music in this one, because if you ask me if I liked it, my eyes are likely to go distant as I begin humming the theme softly to myself while visions of punching guards, running from dogs, and hiding from cameras beneath a cardboard box flit across my mind's eye. That is to say, I don't know, but it'll be in my head forever and I may just be broken. Besides that, there are just over a half dozen other tracks used to punctuate specific events such as boss fights. I will say one thing that OST does well is induce anxiety in a good way. Listening back to it, even divorced from the game, I could still feel my heart rate begin to spike. The best of the bunch for me is probably Red Alert, which plays after getting spotted by a guard. The initial siren is great for setting you on edge before busting out a jam that's a perfect backing track regardless of whether you decide to dodge between guards or throw hands. While Metal Gear may be one of the progenitors of the stealth action genre as it exists today, that isn't always apparent in this specific title. While stealth and sneaking are most definitely core aspects of the game, their importance to the gameplay loop sort of fizzles out in the endgame, wherein punching dudes in the face before making a break for the nearest elevator tends to be an easier solution than trying to stealth past them. But that's getting ahead of myself. The setup here sees Snake infiltrating Outer Heaven armed with nothing but a transceiver and a pair of fists. Anything else must be procured on site. This makes the early going tense as between your low health, abundant enemies, and a lack of resources, you have to quickly become familiar with guard patrol patterns and time your movements accordingly if you wish to make it to your next objective unscathed. Over time, more tools are unlocked, such as keycards granting access to new areas, rations that fully recover Snake's health, around half a dozen unique weapons, as well as a number of situational items such as a gas mask, infrared goggles, and the series staple cardboard box. If the low health bar has you concerned, worry not, as scattered around Outer Heaven are hostages that Snake can rescue. Doing so gradually increases his star rank up to a max of 4. Each rank brings with it a boost to his health as well as increased ammo and ration capacity. All of this means that the farther in the game you get, the more capable Snake becomes, resulting in the aforementioned fisticuffs trumping stealth in the mid to late game. There are two other factors that contribute to this. The first is the lack of enemy variety. A couple new enemy types do get introduced as the game goes on, but they're either uncommon or easy to pick off once you know what to do, meaning the vast majority can be taken out with just a few solid jabs to the dome. The second is the way items respawn. If you find a room that spawns rations, for example, all you need to do to get them to respawn is exit then re-enter the room. Because of this, once you know where something is, if you're running low, it's just a short trek back to the location in question to restock your stores. Speaking of trekking, or perhaps backtracking, this brings me to one of my favorite details about Metal Gear, and really the series as a whole, at least up through Metal Gear Solid 2. That being, Metal Gear is an oft-overlooked entry in the Metroidvania genre. Less than a year after the original Metroid's release on the NES, and a decade before Symphony of the Night hit the original PlayStation, Metal Gear came out swinging with a large, interconnected map made up of several distinct zones, weapon and item-based progression through said zones, as well as backtracking in order to use newly acquired items to access new locations in previously visited areas. Metal Gear has by and large been defined by its contributions to the stealth action genre, which is understandable. While not the first game to feature stealth, it arguably popularized and refined it, laying the blueprint for titles like Tenchu, Thief, and Splinter Cell years later. But this reputation only acknowledges one aspect of Metal Gear's design, that being the way the player interacts with enemies. Just as important is the way that players interact with and progress through the environment. This is especially true in this first game, where the stealth aspect is much less refined than in later entries, meaning the item-based progression has to pull a lot more weight. And it not only pulls that weight, but it does so well that it made Metal Gear a game that I had trouble putting down. The environments are small enough to be easily memorized after just a couple trips, but are still complex, meaning that I had to stay on my toes lest I trip up and alert a guard I didn't mean to. Also, the game nails the feeling of excitement when getting a new item, in part because of how well it teases areas before you can access them. I'd find a locked door or electrified floor and have to file that location in the back of my mind only to gleefully make my way back upon finally nabbing the item necessary to overcome these obstacles. I only really noticed details like these because it was my second time through the game. Before I was only playing for the story, but this time since I know what to expect, I was better able to pay attention to the actual design of the game and came away with a deeper appreciation for it, especially considering how well it still holds up despite its age. The only major sticking point for me is that each numbered keycard is a separate item and you need to be holding the exact right one to unlock doors. This isn't much of an issue when you're progressing into newer areas, as typically the highest numbered keycard will do you just fine. In addition, you'll gradually get an idea of what keycards work where just by virtue of going through areas multiple times. There are, however, occasions where they clearly wanted to trip you up by requiring lower numbered keycards in late game areas, forcing you to quickly switch between keys, trying to find the right one as your health ticks down, whether due to enemy bullets or poison gas. Ultimately, it's a bit of tedium that didn't need to be there, and I'm happy to say that they do away with it as soon as the next game. I also need to mention that a good deal of my enjoyment can likely be attributed to my previous experience with the title and the series as a whole. Had I not already played it before, there's a good chance I'd have gotten stuck when tasked with destroying walls that have no visual indicator that they can be destroyed outside of an exclamation mark when you punch them, or when, in order to unlock a door, you have to call a specific character who might not even answer if you haven't rescued enough hostages. I also might not have known to use mines against the tank boss, or that RC rockets trivialize pretty much every human boss. That is to say that I am coming at this from an experienced perspective, and anyone going into this game relatively blind or without a walkthrough can probably expect a bit more frustration as they try to parse out design language that has been beaten into me over the last decade and a half. This review is probably longer than it needed to be considering Metal Gear is like 4 hours long and not all that complex, but I wanted to give this title its due. The foundation laid here can still clearly be seen in every other main entry in the series. Layers are added, refinements made, but Kojima and his team hit on something special with this game, and that's evidenced by the fact that Metal Gear still remains relevant even to this day. That said, would I recommend folks play through the original Metal Gear? Probably not. It's a similar situation to Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. Fans of the series and video game history should go for it, especially considering the modest length, but even then I suggest having a guide or walkthrough handy. There are just enough outdated design elements that could easily result in you aimlessly circling the map trying to figure out what to do. While that is baked into the experience to a degree, having some guidance will allow you to move on before tedium turns to frustration. For everyone else, though, I'd say skip it. The narrative section of this video gives you everything you need to know to go straight into Metal Gear 2, which, spoilers for my inevitable Metal Gear 2 review, is a fantastic game and one that is much more palatable to modern audiences. Even if I'm not recommending it, I do still love this game. It's clunky, sparse, and outdated, and yet I find myself immensely compelled by it. As long as you know what to do, the pacing is pretty top-notch, the exploration's satisfying, and it's just fun seeing how a series that became so monumental began as something oh so very small. Thank you so much for watching and sticking around to the end. Man, I love Metal Gear. I'm so freaking stoked to get around to the rest of the series. I won't be tackling Metal Gear 2 right away. This project of sorts is aiming to be a bit more comprehensive than just Kojima's work on Metal Gear. For now, if you enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing, dropping a like, and let me know your thoughts on Metal Gear in the comments. And of course, please remember to take care of yourselves, and I gotta say, I think I've snatched up something good for next time.